right. Happy Friday. Welcome into another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. The final summer show of In Touch with Indiana Sports, as over the weekend we will make the official transition into the fall season, which is very exciting. Hopefully you are excited about that as well. Big weekend for Indiana Hoosiers athletics, and I'm not even just talking about football this time. We've got really, this is probably going to be the most basketball heavy show we have had since we've started In Touch with Indiana Sports. And I'm sure some of you are excited about that. Some of you may be indifferent. You just like to see all the teams succeed, and that's great too, because it is, of course, still football season. We are barely a quarter of the way through, and after this week, we'll actually be a third of the way through, at least with the regular season. And Indiana will be taking on the Charlotte 49ers, Biff Pogge's Charlotte 49ers, this Saturday at noon on the Big Ten Network. And we'll talk a little bit about that matchup. Maybe not specifically about the matchup, just because it is another non-conference foe, someone that is pretty inferior to you. I'll tell you some details about Charlotte here later on in the show. But we're going to start off with some basketball stuff today, because over the past few days, there's been a lot of different happenings when it comes to Indiana men's basketball and women's basketball, for that matter. And we'll go ahead and get into those. We'll have Kyler Staley come on here in a few minutes. He's going to help break down really every aspect of the basketball news that has really come through the wire, if you will, over the last few days. He's going to talk about the big recruiting weekend coming up. I know we talked about that with Alec. He'll get us a few more specific details on that. We'll also talk about the schedule. And actually, I do want to talk a little bit about the schedule right now, because there are a few things that I guess I want to point out that I don't point out during my conversation with Kyler. And for those of you who haven't seen the fully released Indiana men's basketball schedule, you can find that on, of course, the Indiana Hoosiers official website. You can also find that on ours, HoosierIllustrated.com, as well as, some analysis on that and that type of stuff. So, but one thing that always intrigues me is figuring out which two Big Ten teams that Indiana will be facing during the middle of the non-conference slate. Because since Indiana, or not really Indiana, since the Big Ten moved on to the 20-game conference schedule, you've had the two Big Ten opponents sandwiched in at some point during your non-conference slate. And I like the way that the non-conference kind of is laid out in general. And I'll start from there then, just to kind of give you a brief map, I guess, of what it all looks like. And I'm not including the exhibitions, by the way. So the official season gets underway on November 6th against SIU Edwardsville, and you follow that up against Eastern Illinois a few days later. So to kick off the season, you have two opponents that you should really not have any trouble with if this team is everything that it's built up to be. So it's two really tune-up games to start the season for Indiana basketball. Then after that, you have your first test, if you will. Maybe it won't be a test necessarily when it comes to, a big name opponent or a top 25 opponent for that matter, but you'll face South Carolina. But it's a step up in competition after your first two cupcake games, if you will, against the South Carolina Gamecocks at home in Bloomington, Indiana. And then you'll have one more tune-up game right after that, just before you go down to the Battle for Atlantis, where you will face three straight big-time opponents in a row, 3 days in a row as well, beginning with Louisville. And I do think that's a good way to open your season before you get into that potential gauntlet of the Battle for Atlantis, depending on who you end up facing in those games. Excuse me for 1 second while I cough. Yeah, man, those the fall allergies are here, man. And hopefully I won't be doing that a whole bunch on some of these episodes here in the near future. But right after the Battle for Atlantis, you have two more games that you should take care of business in, with Sam Houston and Miami of Ohio back at home. And then you have your two Big Ten Conference opponents that take place on December 9th and December 13th. Traditionally, one at home, one in away, as usual. You start off with Minnesota And you follow that up with Nebraska on the road at Pinnacle Bank Arena a few days later. Pinnacle Bank quickly has become one of the tougher venues to get a win at in the Big Ten when it comes to away environments for teams. So that will probably be a very tough matchup for Indiana, especially considering how difficult of a time they had against the Huskers last year. Now, I know rosters change quicker than ever in this new age of college basketball, so it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the exact same style of Nebraska team, but you can expect a tough fight likely in that one. And as always, I do think the expectation should be to go 1-1 at least in those two matchups. If you find yourself 2-0, then more power to you. And maybe with this type of Indiana roster, when we find out how good they actually are, maybe the expectation will be to go 2-0 in both of those games. And again, it really, a lot of it remains to be seen on how good both Minnesota and Nebraska will be. And another thing of note, this will be the only time this season that you play both of those teams, especially now that you've added the 4 West Coast schools. You play a lot less opponents twice per season in this day and age of Big Ten conference basketball. And real quick, let me go ahead and mention who those names are that you play twice, because I don't believe Kyler and I talk about that in our conversation as well. Obviously, you play Purdue. That's something that will more than likely always be a doubleheader for the Indiana Hoosiers. And you do play Ohio State twice, and then you play them at home at the very end of the season. You also play them several weeks before, and then it looks like you play Penn State twice in the season. And is that it? I mean, I guess it makes sense with the amount of teams that you have in the Big Ten Conference. But I'm trying to make sure I'm not overlooking anybody. And heck yeah, that appears to be the case. Again, maybe I'm looking through this too quickly, but it appears that the only 2 teams that Indiana will face twice this year is Ohio State, or 3 teams: Ohio State, Penn State, and then Purdue, of course. So a lot of variety nowadays with the extended Big Ten, where you'll only see, I guess, 3 different times this year you will play an opponent, or the same opponent, I should say. So, and I guess we'll be seeing a lot more of that in future seasons. So, all right. Where do we go from here before we bring on our man Kyler? Obviously, we already mentioned the big recruiting weekend, talked about Charlotte. I do want to play a quick piece, or 2 quick pieces of sound to kind of preface the conversation with Kyler Staley. I decided to pull some sound bites from Mike Woodson's Indiana Basketball Media Days press conference. And 2 things of note, and then I'll maybe throw one more little tidbit in after I play these. But one thing that will surely be pleasing to Indiana fans is something that Mike Woodson said, and it wasn't necessarily his opening statement, but it was the first question he was asked, kind of about the style of play and how things will change with a lot of the new pieces to this Indiana basketball roster.
Well, we're a little bit deeper than we've been in the past years with our ball club. We still have an inside presence with Ballo and Malik, and LT. We can post some as well. But we got guards now that are a lot quicker than we've had in the past. X was probably the quickest guard we've had since we've been here. But I think Miles and Kanan bring a totally different look. And then with Goody, Bryson being, the young freshman who's, very talented, still got to learn the college game, but has played extremely well, I think, this summer for us. But Goody brings us some shooting. We can get Gallo back and get him back in the form that he shot the ball a couple years ago. That will help. And McKenzie has shot the ball well, and Miles and Kanan can make shots. So, it just brings us a totally different look, and we're still in the process of putting it all together.
So there you go, a totally different look. And I'll say this, I don't think Mike Woodson wants to truly abandon the inside out game, because that's always going to be his bread and butter, especially someone who's been around the game as long as he has. It's tough to see somebody truly transition to a fully new style of play. But I do think he also understands that there needs to be some level of adjustment, especially to the new personnel that they have coming in, if you want to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, with the best of the best in college basketball. So it's definitely refreshing to hear different things like that come out of his mouth throughout this press conference, that being really the best example, I feel like, of it. So with that, we'll go and move on. I do want to move on to another comment that he mentioned about Gabe Cupps specifically and how his development has gone so far this offseason heading into this year.
Well, he's had a good summer program. He played well throughout the summer, and he's come back this fall, and he's played well. He's holding his own. He's competitive. He's a kid that likes to compete. He's one of the first kids in the gym and one of the last to leave. So he's going to be in the thick of things. He's going to force coach to have to play him. I mean, that's what it's about, competition. And, we got plenty of it now.
Force coach to play him. And I think one thing that we've always known about Gabe Cupps, even before he stepped foot on campus, is that he was going to be one of the hardest working players on any Indiana basketball team that he was going to be a part of. So, and I know a lot of people weren't pleased with the amount of production that Gabe Cupps contributed to whenever he was on the floor, but every player that has truly put in the work and gone through the Indiana basketball program over the last, really forever, if we're being honest. But I'm mainly thinking about my lifetime and watching players come up and take steps forward. I'm assuming Gabe Cupps is primed to make that type of a jump this year. And again, there's a lot of minutes to be shared with this roster this year, and it's going to be very difficult for anybody, no matter how improved they may be, to kind of make their mark early on if they're not maybe in that initial rotation. But I do think you're going to see Gabe Cupps get some shots to really make his mark and kind of solidify a spot somewhere in the rotation, maybe even more so than last year, because a lot of it he was thrust into positions that he wasn't necessarily meant to be in last year because of some injuries. And as of right now, they're not in that dire of a situation this year going into the fall. Excuse me. So those are the pieces of sound I wanted to share. One other thing I do want to mention, and if you haven't watched the entirety of the Coach Q&A, you can do so right here on the Hoosier Illustrated YouTube page. Do it after you watch the episode if you haven't watched it yet. But one thing that you'll notice that Mike Woodson kind of says repeatedly throughout the press conference, and I'll say this, one thing I love, and some people really get irritated by it with Mike Woodson, he has a lot of things that are kind of his go-tos with the way he talks and phrases things. Obviously, the most infamous one is getting over the hump. He doesn't mention that in this, probably on purpose, because a lot of people really got aggravated with getting over the hump last year, and I'm sure many people are hoping that phrase doesn't have to come out of his mouth much this year. But the other one, before I get to the one that he says today a bunch, is well again. He usually starts off his responses with well again, and I think that's just a funny little thing that I've noticed. And then one thing that he says a lot about this year's team, and he says it probably 4 or 5 times whenever he's talking about various different things during his press conference, he says, only time will tell. And there's truth to it. And I guess I've kind of alluded to it earlier, but when you say only time will tell, he's mainly just referring to he knows he has the pieces that he wants in place to be successful. But until you get the opportunity to show it on the floor, and very similar to what with Kurt Signetti, if we're being honest, until you get that opportunity to put pen to paper, so to speak, all it is talk. How good they're actually going to be, here it comes again, only time will tell. And that time to find out is coming sooner than we think. Less than a month until Hoosier Hysteria. And then a week later, the charity exhibition against Tennessee in Knoxville. And then shortly after that, it will be college basketball season officially once again once we get into those first few days of the month of November. So, a lot to be excited about for Indiana basketball. And right now, I'm going to toss things over. I say toss it over. We're going to have a conversation. Kyler's not going to take over the show for me. I mean, if we're being honest, though, it is his segment. When he comes on, it's all about the man, the myth, the legend, Kyler Staley. So we are going to go ahead and give him the floor. So without further ado, here is basketball recruiting analyst Kyler Staley. Joining me now from talking about the Hoosiers. He's also the HoosierIllustrated.com basketball recruiting analyst. He is the one, the only Kyler Staley. We're recording at a bright and early 7 a.m. here on a Friday. How you doing today, Kyler?
I'm doing good. I've been up for about 2 hours, I would say. Got a quick workout in, so I'm very energized.
Man, you've been up since 5. Is this a regular thing for you?
It tries to be. Most of the week, I try to get up early. I like the freedom of the evenings and stuff and being able to dictate my schedule. So get a workout in super early in the morning, go to work, and then you have, the evening to do whatever you need to do. So, but yeah, I'm all caffeinated. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to start this Friday.
Man, I feel like most people wish they could have that type of self-discipline to be able to get up at 5 in the morning regularly and then be able to enjoy the rest of their day and I guess more specifically their evening in the way in which you do.
Yeah, well, I will say this, it's never easy to get up. I mean, I still struggle every every morning I wake up, I'm cussing at myself. Why am I doing this? But I mean, you do get tired at the middle of the day and stuff. But that's what caffeine's for and everything.
That is what caffeine's for. That is.
Right now,
I'm yet to be caffeinated.
Yeah, right now I'm on a high. I'll probably get some more coffee when I get to work and everything. So, but right now I'm feeling good. So ready to record.
Well, kudos to you. Let's get into a little bit of Indiana basketball. We probably have our biggest little. I don't know what the best phrasing is for it, but this is the most Indiana basketball news we've had to discuss in quite some time. We've had Indiana Basketball Media Day. There's a big recruiting weekend coming up. And then we had the full release of the Big Ten men's and women's basketball schedule just yesterday. So I guess we'll start with Media Day because I don't want to spend too much time on it specifically. I just kind of want to get your general thoughts on how it went. Where do you get the feeling that this vibe is with this new team, with some of these new players, and just your general thoughts on where I guess everybody's heads are right now?
Yeah, so Indiana basketball has been doing this media day specifically for them for the past 3 years, which I think is awesome. It's a real cool experience for the media because we get to talk to every single player and everything, and it's not really kind of dictated what players we get to talk to. Obviously, we always get to talk to Mike Woodson, whether it be Zoom or post game or whatever. But the general vibe I got out of hearing from Mike Woodson, speaking with the players, is that they're excited and they have high expectations for themselves for sure. I think the big thing that came out of that, Mike Woodson said he wants to go more small ball this year. And I think Indiana fans jump for joy on that one. Just the fact that, he is a stubborn coach. He is a very stubborn coach. He wants to play his system, which every coach is like that. But Mike Woodson, he mentioned, he goes, small ball worked for them for a little bit last year. You go back to that 6-game winning streak that they had towards the end of the season. They really shrank the lineup, and you started to see Mackenzie Mbako play the 4, his more natural position. I think you're going to see a lot of that this year. He mentioned, he's like, we want to play Malik Renew more outside as well. We got to get him more outside. He's actually been guarding Mackenzie Mbako and Luke Goody in practice to help him with that position. Malik looks like he slimmed down quite a bit as well. So he looks fit to play that position. It's all about consistency at that point. But also, Mike Woodson mentioned, he goes, there's going to be times where we want to play Luke Goody. We want to play Mackenzie Mbako at the 4, and then either have Ballo or Malik, depending on matchups, playing that 5. I think it would fit better. Obviously, you have Malik Renew as a small ball lineup center. So then you have a lot of shooting. You can space the floor a lot there. But other than that, I mean, we talked to all the players. The big thing that stuck out to me when talking to all the players, it seemed like every single one of them had something great to say about Miles Rice. And it sounds like to me that he has had an insane impact this summer, heading into the fall practices that are about to start. They said that he's a game changer, and that's exactly what you want to hear. I mean, he's a playmaker, dynamic, very, very fast on the ball. Every single one of them mentioned how fast he is on the ball. A lot of people were asking him, who's faster, Xavier Johnson or Miles Rice on the ball. And I remember speaking with Gabe Cubs. He said, I don't know, they're just so different. Where, Miles Rice, he's just got that more of that playmaker mentality and stuff, where X was just go, go, go in a lot of things. So, but, obviously you throw in Cannon Carlisle as well. I mean, Indiana's backcourt, we've mentioned it a ton of times. We've written about it a bunch of times. It's going to be very, very dynamic. But the general vibe is this team has high expectations for themselves. They know what the goal is. And I think they're all excited, towards the end of the day.
One thing that's cool about the getting to do the Indiana basketball media day, getting to speak with each of the different players, and I'm sure you got to speak with all of the new guys specifically. Who had the most unique or different personality when it comes to each of the new guys on this Indiana basketball roster?
The guy, I wouldn't say it's a unique personality, but the guy that I was most impressed with when speaking to is 5-star freshman wing Bryson Tucker.
Okay,
kid,
interesting.
If you go back, and I really encourage the listeners to go to our HoosierIllustrated.com YouTube page and listen to the interviews that we did with him. Very high IQ kid. He speaks extremely well, a very, very smart kid. And, he was complimenting people, someone would ask a question, like, oh, that's a great question and everything. And I mean, he was pretty open about it. He said it was a little weird, in the spring, it was a little awkward. He, kind of mentioned, not really mentioned it, but just kind of hinted at, I don't think Indiana was nearly at on his radar or anything, but with the Liam McNeely stuff, and he was pretty open about that. He's like, with Liam, decommitting and stuff, that spot opened up. And he said he's fit pretty well. And honestly, Mike Woodson, he had high regards for him because someone asked him about Bryson Tucker, and Mike Woodson straight up said he has shown that he belongs, with this team. And there's been multiple reports out there. John Rothstein reported it maybe a few weeks ago. He said that, Bryson Tucker's really, really impressed. And, Mike Woodson, Bryson Tucker is one of the wild cards of this team. You throw with him and Ja'Kai Newton, but I think Bryson Tucker, you're actually going to see some minutes out of him this year, just from what he can do. Very versatile player. You can play him, as a ball handler. You can play him off the ball, and at some points you could even see him at the 4 at times. So, was really, really impressed with him. I think he's a very smart kid, and I'm really excited to see what he brings for Indiana.
And you mentioned Ja'Kai Newton being really that other wild card. What'd you get from him and kind of where his mentality is coming into the season?
Yeah, so obviously the big thing was, the injury and stuff. And we asked about him, asked Mike Woodson, he was like, how is Ja'Kai or whatever? And so Ja'Kai has good and bad days. He's still recovering from that injury. And you got to remember, Ja'Kai Newton has not played nearly over 2 years of basketball, which is crazy to think, and that's really hard to do. But I think Ja'Kai Newton's got a little bit of that. He's a dog, right? He's got that dog in him. He's got that dog in him. But you ask Ja'Kai Newton, he goes, I'll be good. I'll be fine and everything. He's like, he's ready to play. He's ready to defend. I think Ja'Kai Newton takes a lot of pride on the defensive end, and he's just ready to go in there and play. That's how a lot of those Atlanta kids, they have that mentality, and that's exactly what he has. So, but it's going to be, you take your time with Ja'Kai Newton, right? You play him at certain spots. He's got to shake the rust off. Obviously, he's been going, for the most part this summer in practice and whatnot, but playing in a game setting, it's a little bit different. So you would hope, I think the whole team's going to be healthy before their first exhibition game. I don't know about the Tennessee charity game or not. But Ja'Kai Newton, obviously coming back from an injury, he's just a guy that you got to watch for, and you just got to be patient with at the end of the day.
And one thing I've talked here and there about the charity exhibition at the end of October. What are kind of your overall thoughts on this? Should we expect there to be kind of a full display of what Indiana basketball can show with this new look roster? Because obviously you don't want anybody getting hurt in those types of games. You don't really want to show maybe everything on tape from the get-go. At least whenever you think about it, I tend to think of it back to like a football standpoint. When you're playing the lesser opponents, you don't necessarily want to throw the whole playbook at them. And I know this isn't the exact same thing, but since this really is Indiana's first time playing in one of these charity exhibitions, what do you think their approach will be to something like that?
I think Mike Woodson will keep it pretty basic. He's not going to force players to play if, Trey Galloway, Ja'Kai Newton, if they're not 100%. I don't think he's going to force those guys to play. But at the same time, I think Mike Woodson, the guys that are available, he's just going to let them play, because this is a great opportunity for Mike Woodson to see, okay, this is what we have. and everything. This is what we need to build off of. This is what we need to work on with that. But, in those type of things, you obviously don't want to get anybody hurt. You don't want to overextend minutes or anything like that. But I expect also Mike Woodson to kind of toy around with lineups as well. See what works, what doesn't work, and just kind of build off of that. The good thing is they obviously have 2 more exhibition games after that charity event. So I think it's going to be a really fun event. I'm glad that Indiana's doing that. That seems to be the common theme to do it. Obviously, it goes to a great cause as well. But, I think you'll keep it simple at the end of the day. But at the same time, you just let the guys play and see what they can do on the floor.
And speaking of the schedule, obviously we mentioned at the beginning of this that finally the Big Ten men's and women's basketball schedules were released in full yesterday. Obviously, we'll speak mainly on the men here, but the first thing most people look at least the first thing that I always look at, is which Big Ten teams do you end up playing that get sandwiched right into that, really the end of the non-conference slate there. And this year you've got Minnesota at home and Nebraska on the road. Nebraska seems to be a fairly frequent draw for Indiana when it comes to the teams that Indiana typically gets matched up with during the early slate of the Big Ten season before you turn over in the calendar year. I guess we'll just start there. Do you like those 2 matchups? And then we'll get into the rest of the build for the schedule.
Yeah, I mean, they're not the toughest matchups in the world, but at the same time, you kind of wish that those were a little bit reversed. You kind of hope that you were playing at Minnesota and then you have Nebraska at home, just because Nebraska, they're actually a pretty good team now.
Very tough road opponent too.
Tough road opponent. Indiana struggled with them. We all know about it. They lost, I think it was 3 straight to them last year. 2 or 3 straight. I can't remember.
Yeah, they lost the home and the away, and then they lost in the Big Ten tournament.
Yeah. So very, very tough matchup. Nebraska's going to be a good team. They did really good in the transfer portal and stuff. But I mean, it is what it is at the end of the day. Obviously, I know Signetti's always talking about on the football side. He's always talking about how, bring our schedule, we'll play whoever, whatever. I mean, I think Mike Wilson's the same way. It's just, next team on the schedule as well. Overall thoughts with the schedule, I think it is kind of challenging in a little bit of a way. It's definitely balanced. And I was looking at all the other Big Ten team schedule and stuff. I mean, a lot of balance in this league. There's no really team schedule that I looked at and I was just like, you know what, this is a really easy path for them or not. Obviously, throwing the wrinkle of traveling out west, which Indiana, kind of fortunate, does not travel out west until the towards the end of the year. And then obviously you got the 2 California teams that are coming into town throughout the Big Ten schedule. But I mean, definitely if Indiana is going to compete for a Big Ten championship, I think, and they win it, I think they're absolutely going to deserve it because I think it's going to be a challenge this year. The Big Ten is going to be a lot deeper this year than what it was. But it's definitely going to be a challenge. It's not the most, it's balanced. I'll say that it's balanced overall.
I'm going to quickly run through the matchups from the beginning of January through the end of the year. You start off with Rutgers at home, follow that up with a road matchup at Penn State. After that, you face your first Big Ten matchup against somebody that's from the West Coast with USC. Then you go back on the road to Iowa, following that up with a home matchup with Illinois. Then you have 2 straight road games at Ohio State and then at Northwestern. Back home with Maryland for a one-off home game. Then your first rivalry matchup with Purdue on the road on January 31st. That date was announced a couple of weeks ago. You'll also travel to Wisconsin. After that, you'll have Michigan at home on February 8th. Michigan State on the road February 11th. Then you have UCLA, your second California school, at home on February 14th. You'll have your rematch with Purdue, which, Kyler, you may have seen this already. It's on the 40th anniversary of Bob Knight's chair throwing. Isn't that a little interesting tidbit right there?
You almost wonder if it was planned for that, but
it has to be. There's no way that wasn't done on purpose.
It's still cool. That's still a cool little nugget there.
Yeah. And then after that, you have this is, by the way, it's a 3-game stretch at home that Indiana does not have at any other point in the season with UCLA, Purdue, and then Penn State. And then right after that is your only West Coast road trip of the season, as Kyler alluded to earlier, with at Washington on March 1st and at Oregon on March 4th. And then you come back home to wrap up the regular season on March 8th against Ohio State before the Big Ten tournament gets rolling in Indianapolis in mid-March. So, yeah, overall, I do think it does appear to be very favorable whenever you think about how it could have been laid out with travel and that type of stuff. And again, very balanced, because we really don't know who the top tier of the conference is going to be at this point in time. And we have an idea of who the teams could be, but it feels like we're pretty far removed at this point from the few years that were when the Big Ten had really the best of the best in college basketball, and it felt like you were going to be in a dogfight night in and night out. Maybe that will be the case in this new look Big Ten, but before we have any sort of sample, there's no way to know if that will be the case just yet, I feel like.
No, there's not. I mean, it's way too early to tell. You obviously got to see these teams play on the basketball floor at the end of the day against a different opponent. I think, like I said, I think the Big Ten is going to be way better than it was last year. I think it was maybe 4 or 5 teams that made the Big Ten tournament or made the NCAA tournament last year. And Indiana finished 5th and didn't even make it. So, but yeah, I think it's going to be really balanced this year. You know, every Big Ten game, no matter who's against, it's tough. I mean, there's not a gimme game at all. You know, people were talking about the non-conference schedule with Indiana. You know, how quote unquote easy it looked and there wasn't anything. Well, honestly, you got to rack up a lot of wins here. You want to have a good amount of wins going into the Big Ten season, and just kind of see what happens there. But like I mentioned earlier, balanced schedule. Indiana, if they're going to win a Big Ten championship, they're definitely going to earn it based off this schedule. And that goes with pretty much any team, because I just think it's really balanced at the end of the day. I think it's pretty big that they only go out west, you know, towards the end of the season. But it is a tough final stretch. So we're just going to kind of see what this Indiana team is made of. They definitely are the most talented team in the Big Ten on paper. So they honestly just got to figure out a way to live up to that hype.
We're officially less than a month until Hoosier Hysteria, so it's pretty hard to believe that basketball season truly will be here before we know it, and we'll be covering both these Indiana Hoosier football and basketball teams as we continue on through the fall season. One more thing I want to hit up on before we wrap up this segment here today, and that is the big recruiting weekend we've had coming up with Trent Sisley, Eric Reeb, and Braylon Mullins in town. Talked a little bit about it with Alec Lasley earlier in the week. I want to get your thoughts on really the importance of it and how you foresee each of it going with maybe, I don't want to necessarily ask your predictions on if they end up committing to Indiana in the long run, but just how you foresee all of this going for each of these guys.
Yeah, obviously, I think this is the biggest. This is easily the biggest weekend for Indiana basketball of the fall. You've got 3 of your top targets on campus all at the same time. I think Eric Reeb, by multiple reports, I think he's already on campus. So he's kind of getting an early start, and I expect both Mullins and Sisley to get to Bloomington probably around the same time, maybe tonight as well. So obviously they'll be in attendance for the Charlotte game tomorrow. But honestly, this is kind of your final pitch in a lot of ways. Not necessarily your final pitch, but it's your final pitch as they're, you know, on your home floor as well. You know, these are 3 guys, especially when you look at Sisley and Mullins, guys that Indiana has been recruiting for a very, very long time. And it's time for you to kind of, you know, put all your chips on the table. And just say, you know, look, we really need you guys. We really want you guys as well. And we need you in an Indiana uniform. Eric Reeb, obviously, he's kind of the wild card in this kind of situation because, you know, he is kind of newer in a lot of ways. But obviously, when Malachi Moreno went to Kentucky, even before that as well, Indiana really put all their chips on the table with him. You know, they offered him around this time last year. Talks were pretty quiet. And then the spring, it just really popped off. You know, you've got the whole Indiana staff going to, I think his high school's in Maryland. So you got the whole Indiana staff going over there to look at him. You know, they've made multiple visits, you know, to Greenfield Central to see Braylon Mullins, which is a quick drive for them. And then they even made the trip all the way down to Florida to see Trent Sisley as well down at Montverde Academy. So, Braylon Mullins, a guy that, you know, really popped off this year. And he had nearly every blue blood college program out after him and stuff. And Trent Sisley is a guy that's kind of kept his core 5, you know, schools that have been recruiting him. And Indiana's done a really good job, offered him before he even played a single high school game. And then we already talked about Eric Reeb, but this is big for Indiana, big for Mike Woodson. The 2025 class was the very first class that he really had a chance to, you know, from start to finish to really recruit. And luckily, you know, most of the guys that he is recruiting are high profile in-state guys, and you could really win back the state in a lot of ways based off of this stuff. But I expect starting next week and then the following week afterwards, I think we're going to start seeing some commitments there. Things are looking good for a few of the IU targets that are there. So I won't get into specific names, but I think you'll start to see the chips, you know, kind of fall, the dominoes kind of fall. And we'll just kind of see what happens there. But monster weekend, you really got to show out this weekend in front of these recruits and just kind of see what happens after that.
What about with Jalen Harrelson canceling his visits not too long ago? I know he's not a part of this recruiting weekend. He did show up in Bloomington for his weekend at the beginning of football season. Anything you can share of, on how maybe when his decision might be coming?
Yeah, I think it's going to come pretty soon. And honestly, I could see it probably coming out next week some point. So
okay.
He did cancel some visits there. Indiana was one of the first, was one of the first schools to offer him, and they built a really strong relationship and done a really good job on that recruitment. Mike Woodson, I think, really values him. Obviously, Mike Woodson's a big point guard guy, and he wants to have a dynamic point guard in the backcourt as well. And he wants a guy that's a playmaker, and that's exactly what Jalen Harrelson is. He's probably one of the more unselfish players that I've ever seen on the basketball floor. That the dude would rather get a really good assist than get a bucket for himself, even though he could do both at a high level. But yeah, I think you'll start to see where he's going to commit starting soon. There are some rumblings that he may be canceling the Purdue visit, but that's not confirmed by any means. So, which that Purdue visit is scheduled for this weekend. So we will see. But I think he is going to have a decision on what school he's going to go to probably around next week sometime. And we'll just kind of see, after that, all the dominoes start to fall, I think.
It's going to be a big couple of weeks for Indiana basketball and really Mike Woodson as one of his biggest criticisms last year. I mean, outside of what we saw on the floor specifically was really, I don't want to say his inability to recruit, but just the way he approached recruiting last year and how it just really, and not that fans should have a say so in everything because fans ultimately don't necessarily, I mean, they all, most of them have been coaches, if we're being honest. So we can't always act like that the fan way is the true way. But at the same time, excuse me, trying to not cough while I'm talking here, but maybe we'll just leave that as is. I don't want to sit there and go off on a rant on anything I don't necessarily planned on getting into. But Kyler Staley, appreciate the time as always. And I'll see you. We'll talk tomorrow for the Indiana football postgame show for HoosierIllustrated.com.
Yes, sir. Make sure you guys hit that subscribe button on our HoosierIllustrated.com YouTube page, and join. We love to hear your comments as well. So, but yeah, we will definitely talk tomorrow, and hopefully, Indiana starts on 4-0. That best start in a long, long time. So we'll see about it.
Big shout out, as always, to Kyler Staley for taking the time to break down everything that is Indiana men's basketball. And be sure to join us on really tomorrow afternoon. Indiana's got the early kick tomorrow. Join us for the HoosierIllustrated.com postgame show, and we'll recap everything that goes on tomorrow with Indiana versus Charlotte. Before we get into some more college football stuff, I do want to do a quick rundown of the Indiana women's conference schedule that was released. I know Kyler and I didn't get into that, but here's a little look at what the women's basketball conference slate looks like this year. On December 7th, they'll have a one-off at Penn State before a couple of more non-conference matchups before they get into the full swing of things at the end of December. Home against Wisconsin, following that up with home against UCLA, their first matchup against a West Coast opponent. Then they'll have two straight road games, first at Northwestern and then on the road at Iowa. Then they'll come back home for a one-off against Illinois. And then it's a long road trip at Oregon and at Washington, similar to how the Indiana men's conference slate sets up, except it's at a different point of the season. Then back home again against Rutgers, on the road at Michigan. Then two straight home games, first against Purdue and then Ohio State. And then, okay, this is weird. The Indiana website mistakenly has the same game listed twice, and that is at Michigan State. They only play them once, obviously, not twice on the road, back-to-back. And then they will wrap up their final two games before the Big Ten tournament against Maryland at home, and then rounding out the season against Purdue once again on the road. And then the Big Ten tournament will be held in Indianapolis. So there you go. The Indiana women's basketball, again, very balanced. They're going to have to get used to life without Mackenzie Holmes. I think that will be the early storyline for the Indiana women's basketball team this year, and we will follow them along throughout the season as it gets underway here in the fall, just like the Indiana men's team. So All right, coming up next, going to bring in our man Jeffrey the Greek. It's been a few weeks since we've talked with him about Big Ten football, and I'm going to get his thoughts on everything regarding the Hoosiers and how they've looked through the first 3 weeks of the college football season. And I'll maybe get his thoughts on really how the rest of the Big Ten is stacking up and maybe how the Hoosiers will fare moving forward. So without further ado, here is Jeffrey the Greek. All right. Joining me now, Mr. Jeffrey the Greek from the Eyes on Big podcast. Once again, glad to have you back on In Touch with Indiana Sports, especially with the good vibes that the Hoosiers football program is currently bringing. And it's very exciting right now.
And it's not just good. I feel like it's not just good vibes for Indiana fans. There's a ton of non-Purdue Big Ten fans and fans around the country that are absolutely loving the Hoosier team. I called it. I don't care. I'll break my arm, pat myself on the back. I told everybody that would listen to me that this Hoosier team was ready to get off to a hot start. I didn't even think it would be this hot, though. The Hoosiers look incredible.
No, I don't think anybody did. And we're probably not going to learn a whole lot of new things about them this week when they face Charlotte. But, I mean, it is what it is. You got to get your final gimme out of the way. But nonetheless, it is still exciting for Indiana. And I'll tell you what, when Maryland comes to town next week, that'll be the next real tell on whether or not this Indiana team is truly taking that step forward, because the UCLA game, although impressive, there is a chance that there is a little, maybe it's kind of a red herring of sorts, not to take away from anything positive that Indiana did, but I do think that there's a very real chance that this UCLA team outside of Purdue is probably the worst team in the conference.
Nice Purdue shot you got in there. I would say, but I would also say, UCLA and Purdue, they have Power 4 athletes. Okay. It's not void of talent. Okay. So it's still a step up in competition. And it just seemed like whenever Indiana wanted to do what they wanted to do, they did it in that game. I would say that I'm most surprised about the Hoosier defense. I kind of expected the offense to be explosive. What I had predicted was really fun Hoosier games where sometimes they put up 42 points but give up 38. They're putting up 42 points, but they ain't giving up 13 in these games. It's been incredible what Siggy's been able to do on defense. And I can say this because I'm not a Hoosier fan, so I don't have jinxing abilities for your squad. You got to keep Rourke healthy, okay? Yep. That is the most important part. He has not shown the propensity to stay upright and healthy the whole year. So this weekend, I almost took the points. I actually wound up taking Indiana to cover the mighty large spread. I got.
And I'll say this, and this may sound cocky of me, but I thought the spread would be much higher. I thought it would be mid-30s.
I said the same. I on the Eyes on Big podcast on all podcast platforms. I said, nice. We said if Indiana had an SEC logo or a Big Ten blue blood logo on their jersey, that would be like a 30. That would be a higher spread, but it's still lower because people are used to the Hoosiers a little bit. I got 42-10, but the one thing that I thought about to bring that spread lower to, that they wouldn't cover it is you got to start getting Rourke out of these games, getting people out of the games. But ultimately, Stiggy's such a red ass for even the backups that I think they'll still try to drive the ball down the field and tackle in space, man. So that's what won out on me for Indiana to go ahead and cover the line.
Where do you feel like Rourke stacks up with the other elite quarterbacks? I'm not trying to call Rourke elite. Maybe he ends up being elite as the season goes on. But where do you feel like he stacks up with the best of the best in the conference? Because I heard people last week during the UCLA game, and again, maybe this is a stretch, but I did hear it from multiple people, so I did kind of run with it a little bit, that he has a little Tom Brady game manager in him, just the way that he kind of sees the field. And I'm not saying he'll be Tom Brady, because that's not happening. Nobody's going to be Tom Brady. It's more like the style in which, just the way that he carries himself as a game manager on the field.
I don't know if Tom Brady would be my comp. A little bit more mobile.
That's a tough name to throw out there for anybody when you're comparing anyone.
I would throw him out to be more like a beefy Trace McSorley. That's
Okay.
what but at college level, not NFL
Yeah.
level Trace McSorley. So I don't know about throwing him out to arguably the GOAT, but long
Exactly.
story
Yeah,
short, he's making it work. I would probably put him behind Dylan Gabriel right now, as far as he'll have to keep looking very high level, like 3-1, 4-1 touchdown ratio type of stuff to get into that conversation, because there's not a lot of marquee games on Indiana's schedule to have that quote unquote Heisman moment, type of thing. But if he's even in the conversation, I would think that means Indiana's winning a lot of games, and I would think that means Indiana fans are pretty excited about it.
If there's one thing that you want to see differently, and again, they haven't played anybody, so there's not a lot of flaws that have been shown yet. I know there's probably some things that will get exposed. And really the biggest thing that I've taken away is, and this is a very small thing first, they don't finish out the second quarter very well.
Yeah.
And again, that's a very small thing, and that can get cleaned up. Hopefully this weekend we'll see them close that out very well. But then penalties. And I know a lot of the targeting stuff last week is kind of
BS.
different than your traditional penalties.
Yeah,
but being able just to clean up the flags thrown at you in general, because when you rack up over 100 yards of penalties, even if some of those are a little BS, that's something that you do want to fix in the long term.
I'd like to be a fly on the wall in those positional meeting rooms or team meetings as Siggy is just roasting somebody, for a procedural penalty and everything. But yeah, those targeting calls were absolute horse hockey. So, and I was tweeting out. I had a couple cocktails last Saturday night, and I was irate on some of those calls. So you can't even really count those. But yeah, clean up the penalties a little bit. I would say this: if there is a possible, crack in the armor, I don't know if it's a dominant rushing attack. Would be what I would say. Not bad. I just don't know if I've seen that yet, especially when you consider the competition. So if it's a situation where you have to close out a game, a closer game, or the rushing attack isn't quite there, and you're constantly put in, 3rd and 7+, that would be what I would be probably most concerned about if I'm a Hoosier fan. But I'm not saying it doesn't look good with the rushing attack, but just not sure if I'm 100% seen that yet.
And real quick, I don't know if you saw this, but CJ West, he was one of the victims of the targeting calls last week. They ended up overturning that, so he will not have to miss the first half of this game. What's the deal with that? Imagine if that had been, a close game and they end up overturning that after the fact. It's just a very weird system they have in place with targeting. And I don't want to dwell on it much further than that. Just wanted to point out that CJ West will, it's not happening, or he doesn't have to sit out the way that they thought he was going to have to.
I mean, first of all, anybody with a brain knows that somebody getting thrown out of a half for the following game for something that he does the previous game is quite possibly the stupidest rule in the history of all sports, not just college football. It's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. This is not a contact sport. This is a collision sport. Don't want to get hit. I've got kids that are coming up onto tackle football. Don't want them to play tackle football just yet. They don't have to go out. Nobody's putting a gun up to your head to have your kid play tackle football. So there's one way to remove yourself from that situation. I know I'm old school. Oh, horrible that I. But
Cignetti's old this school, though. Indiana fans are getting acclimated to that now.
Good. And long story short is, yes, the old school spearing is what we used to call it, spearing. When you just drill somebody with the top of your helmet, that's potentially dangerous for the spearer and the spearee. Okay, so I don't want to see that. If it's an aggressive situation like that, you can toss that guy out for the rest of the game, 15-yard penalty, whatever. But even in that case, that person shouldn't be gone the next game, and they really should clean it up, especially if it's hitting with your helmet, front of your helmet, hitting the shoulder pad. Just let it go. I have a small amount of faith that someday this will get legislated out and we'll start using our brains.
Real quick, in the rest of the Big Ten, while I still got you for a few minutes, big game for Iowa this weekend with the Floyd of Rosedale in Minnesota versus Iowa. How do you feel about that matchup? I'll say this right now. I'm taking the under. I feel like both defenses are really solid. Minnesota coming off 2 shutouts, and obviously Iowa known for historically having a really good defense, and I think that will still hold up in this game. So my take is I think I got it at minus 36.5 for the under.
Okay,
Not
so
minus,
that means it went up
36.5
under. So that means it went up a little bit. So that means the public is betting it up a little bit,
which is surprising.
I might disagree with you a little bit.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough.
By the way, Floyd or Rosedale, greatest rivalry trophy in the history of rivalry trophies. Listen, Minnesota's defense has looked good 3 games in a row. Iowa's defense has looked good 3 games in a row. Gave a couple big shots that have happened to them in the throw game, just giving up double moves. It's been a double move every time. Other than that, Iowa's defense has been dominant. But I just think I see a little bit more points here than what people expect. Not heavy. I've got 23-17 Iowa in this game. That's just over. That's 40 points. It's not like I got that thing screaming over. I will have to see Minnesota's linebackers consistently stop Iowa's rushing attack before I believe Iowa can't put any points on the board. Iowa is starting to shed the last 2 years offensive woes in people's minds. Their games have gone over with Iowa's offensive points. So we'll see. Now, with that being said, if Minnesota stops Iowa's rushing attack and Minnesota's passing attack doesn't hit big shots on Iowa's defense, then you're going to hit your bet and we're going under. But I think just a little bit more points than what Vegas is seeing.
Who else do you like so far? And I know it's been very weird in this new season of college football where you have a lot of teams taking early bye weeks. I heard you talking about Ohio State. They had the early week 2 bye or week 3 bye, whatever it was, and they're coming back and they're playing Marshall. It's weird that you're getting all the way through the month of September and some of your biggest brands in the Big Ten have yet to face anybody that's really worth a damn.
I'm hard to please in that. I'm an oddity. I love the double idle weeks. I think it's great. I like
it too. I just think it's weird that there's so many early ones.
I agree with that. And that's what I was going to say is I like the double idle week, yet I don't like early or late idles and, off weeks. So I'm sure from the Big Ten's point of view, they say, well, we can't have everybody idle the first week in October and the first week in November, something like that. You gotta spread these idle weeks out a little bit so that you have enough inventory to put on TV. So it's a hard thing to do. I would say week 2 idle weeks and the first 2 weeks of the season and the last 2 weeks of the season should be abolished for idle weeks. That's just too early and too late. So that does leave week 3 open. As far as Ohio State, I'm just ready for Ohio State to see somebody play somebody with a pulse. I think State fans are ready to see that as well. I mean, they're going to dog walk Marshall tomorrow. So it is what it is. The idle weeks and where they fall, it will always, and if it's a good thing or not, it'll always depend on what your team looks like, injury status report. Like I think Wisconsin's idle week being this weekend is perfect for them because they're licking their wounds and they need to get a couple things figured out. So you'll never know for sure, but 2 idle weeks through the year, I hope that's something that catches on permanently.
So who else do you think has been an early standout in the conference before we wrap this thing up?
Nebraska has looked really good, yet, we're into, as we joked, they haven't played anybody season. That's not just for Nebraska. That's for everybody. We got a game tonight. Illinois at Nebraska. That's going to be a fun one right there for people that, don't have high school football to check out. It's going to be awesome. So we'll learn a lot about both teams with Illinois and the Illinois and Nebraska. I got Hoosiers on the brain. But I do think Nebraska has looked really good. The defense is stellar 2 years in a row. Dylan Raiola has looked really good on offense. They'll get a little bit more of a challenge tonight, I think, than what they've had before. But they've looked really, really good. And I would have maybe said Washington up until last week when they lost the Apple Cup game. But overall, I would say 1-16 is really good in the Big Ten. Okay. There's not an easy layup in there. So that's what I kind of expected from the Big Ten for the most part. I mean, if you have 18 teams, you're going to get a couple underperformers in there. That's just how the math works out. But everybody expected the top 2 or 3 teams to be great. They have been. But man, 4 through like I said, 16. There's some tough teams in there.
Yeah, I'm excited to see things kind of, the further we get into the season, the best will separate themselves. I do think you're right. There will be a very tight middle of the pack probably throughout the majority of the season again, but everything works itself out the further you get into things. So I'm excited to see how that works out. Eyes on Big is out right now for this weekend.
We are out. Had a little bit of a delay. We usually get it out Wednesday night. We had to get it out Thursday evening, but it's out. So yeah, it's my podcast partner, JW Eggleston 7, Jordan and I, we pick every single game against the spread, over-unders. We pick it all. So we got a couple of them that we like. My Amador double barrel lock of the week is the over tonight in Illinois and Nebraska. I think Jordan's he's got Rutgers plus the points. He's got Rutgers. We both have Rutgers winning outright versus Virginia Tech. That's another good game. Rutgers coming off an early season idle week, so look for them to be dialed in before they go into Va-Tech. So that's another good weekend, I would say. Just overall, this was a great podcast to record, the Eyes on Big podcast, because there's a lot of good games this weekend. 12 games, and a couple of them big on big action, and then even the non-conference games are great too.
Good stuff. Well, Jeffrey, appreciate you as always. We'll continue to try to check in every few weeks. Hopefully, potentially next time we talk, if things go the way that both Indiana and Nebraska fans want them to go, we may be looking at a 6-0 start for both as they face each other at the midway point of the season. Talked about that very early on. Don't know if that will pan out that way, but that certainly would be very intriguing if it does work out that way.
And I had them, I believe I either had Indiana 5-1 going into that game and beating Nebraska, and I had Nebraska undefeated going into that game, getting beat by the Hoosiers. So we'll see how close I am when that happens.
Could be exciting. Jeffrey, appreciate you.
Yep.
A big shout out to Jeffrey the Greek for making time with us today, and we will continue to try and check up with him every few weeks throughout the Indiana football and the Big Ten season moving forward. Let's get into the Big Ten football roundup for the week, shall we? I don't know if that's the official name of this. I think I just kind of gave it a name. Who knows if I will call it that in the future, but essentially what I'm going to do is go through a lot of the Big Ten matchups of the week and some of the top 25 as well, and let you know what I think might happen, let you know if I'm betting on the game, and maybe you'll tail me, maybe you'll fade me. But if you tailed me last week, I'll go ahead and remind you we went 3-0. So hopefully we ride that momentum into this weekend and hopefully go 3-0 once again. I would have gone 3-1. I guess I did go 3-1, but I didn't parlay my final pick with the other 3, thankfully. So the official parlay did hit, but I did miss UK and Georgia. I thought Georgia would completely blow the Wildcats out of the water, and that ended up not being the case. So let's go ahead and move into the games going on this week across the conference, and it all begins tonight with number 24 Illinois going into the friendly confines of number 22 Nebraska tonight at 8 p.m. on Fox. Probably the best matchup of the weekend, one of the best matchups, I should say, when it comes to Big Ten, not rivals necessarily, but, a conference matchup. And this will be really not the first major test for both teams, because Nebraska had a test with Colorado and Illinois had a test with Kansas, both two different types of tests, if we're being honest. But these two teams will be sizing each other up, who really wants to take that next step forward as a program with this type of game. Nebraska currently favored by 7.5 points. The over-under set at 42.5. I won't be betting on this game. This is a stay away for me. But if I were predicting an outcome, I do think with the home field advantage and the momentum that Matt Rule has going on with Nebraska and their freshman quarterback, Dylan Raiola, I do think Nebraska will find a way to pull this out tonight. Also, their 400th straight sellout tonight, which is absolutely insane. But we all know that outside of Cornhusker football, I'm assuming there is absolutely nothing to do in Nebraska, which is why they're able to sell out so many games And really that kind of be the center tourist attraction, if you will, in the state of Nebraska. Moving on to the Saturday slate, starting things off with number 12, I was saying number 12. It's a noon game, 12 o'clock. Marshall at number 3, Ohio State on Fox. Ohio State yet to really play anyone of note this year, and they're also coming off an early bye week, so still don't have a lot of data, if you will, on the Buckeyes and figuring out how good they're actually going to be. They're favored by 39.5 points, I should say, and the over-under 52.5. I do think they won't have much trouble with Marshall here, but at the same time, the Buckeyes I'm sure a lot of these players want to play a meaningful game, and to be this far into the year and not play a whole lot of games that really tell you how your team really is, I'm sure that's frustrating just to an extent for fans and players alike and the coaches. I think Ohio State will roll here, not betting on a spread that big, especially when you never know when they're going to pull backups and stuff like that or bring the backups in. So, excuse me, I'm going to try not to cough on the air. I think I've done a fairly good job of it so far today, but you can feel the tickles coming on, and it can be a little distracting in some way. But let's go and move on to Charlotte and Indiana. Again, not a whole lot to say that we haven't already talked about, but there are a couple of tidbits that I want to mention. CJ West, Indiana's defensive player, one of Indiana's defensive players, I should say, that was called for targeting last week. After the post-game review, I guess is the best way to say it, his targeting has been overturned. And because his targeting happened in the second half, he was initially going to miss part of this game against Charlotte. And so CJ West, because it was overturned, will not have to miss any of the time that he was originally slated to miss against the 49ers. So that's good news. Also, from the Charlotte side of things, I believe this is true. I heard this from somebody yesterday that is a sports betting guy, not, affiliated with me, but affiliated with a different show that I do, or that I'm part of, not that I host or anything. But his name's Brian Edwards. I'll go ahead and shout him out. I think he's with Vegas Insider. But he mentioned that Charlotte is down to their third string quarterback. And if that's any indication of how this game will probably go, then I think Indiana should roll. And they should roll anyway against a team like Charlotte. But when you're down that bad already, when it comes to personnel, and Indiana's favored by 28.5 in this, by the way, over under 48.5. I wish I included this in my parlay. I made the parlay pretty early in the week, but for some reason I didn't include this. If you haven't done it already and you're looking for, you just want to bet with your heart, as they say, go ahead and take Indiana to cover minus 28.5. There's been nothing that Indiana has put on the field that should make you doubt that they would have any trouble with Charlotte. The one thing that I would be weary of, I guess, is the possibility of a letdown after the type of win the type of showing, I should say, that they put on at UCLA last week. That's the one thing that would maybe make me hesitate to bet on this game if I were you listening to me. So do with that what you will. The over-under set at 48.5. That may be an easy bet as well. Taking the over just depends on how you view it. But let's move forward. Villanova at Maryland. Maryland only favored by 17.5 against an FCS opponent, Villanova. And I'm sure if this were a couple of weeks ago, they'd be favored by a lot more. But, they had that early loss to Michigan State, and they had to go and win on the road at Virginia last week to make that up. So, again, not betting on this one. I know some of you are like, when are you going to get to what you're actually betting on? Well, I'll get to it here in just a moment. There are a couple of Big Ten games I'm getting on some action in, and we just haven't gotten to them yet. And then there's one top 25 game I've got some action on that I'll mention at the very end. But Maryland minus 17.5. If I were betting on that game, I would take Maryland to cover that because, again, FCS opponents, you should be able to handle with ease. But maybe Maryland's not good enough to handle them with ease. We'll have to wait and see. Up next, the first game that I've got on my parlay, Kent State at number 10, Penn State. And Penn State is favored by 49 points. And I know Kent State is terrible. I know that. But I don't think Penn State has shown us anything yet that proves that they can run a team out of the stadium the way that maybe they should. They played West Virginia on the road and they beat them, and that was a good win. But they struggled with Bowling Green in their second game. And Bowling Green is not a bad MAC program per se, not as bad as Kent State. But 49 points, I just think that's too much. So I'm taking Kent State to cover plus 49, and that's the first leg of our weekend parlay. Let's take a quick drink of coffee. Excuse me. Trying to clear them pipes up. All right, number 11, USC, and number 18, Michigan. USC favored by 5 on the road. Second time this season that the defending national champion has been an underdog at home. Other game being against Texas, of course. And I wouldn't be surprised if USC takes care of business similar to the way that Texas did. I'm still I'll keep preaching it until I don't need to any longer. And I just don't think Sharon Moore is going to be a good coach. And I don't think their teams or his team this year is going to end up being, an elite caliber opponent. Maybe they'll prove me wrong this weekend, but we'll see that they've already made a quarterback change with Alex Orji. I mentioned that the other day. So if that ends up being a good move, maybe they end up being a lot better and end up winning this game against USC. So similar to Mike Woodson, only time will tell on if that will work out. So, but my prediction here is that USC comes into the big house and gets the win. Next up, UCLA on the road at number 16 LSU. LSU favored by 22.5. And man, I don't know what's going to happen with this UCLA team. They may get slaughtered. They may battle just because LSU's coached by Brian Kelly and they seem to, not live up to their potential. They play to their competition, if you will. So it wouldn't surprise me if this game ends up being closer than 22.5. But I also think UCLA is really bad. So maybe LSU ends up winning by 30 or 40. We'll have to see. And we'll kind of learn more, maybe more so about Indiana's potential based on what UCLA does here. So that's an interesting game to keep an eye on if you're a Hoosier fan. And then we'll move on now to Rutgers at Virginia Tech. Their first real test, the Scarlet Knights, as they go on the road against an ACC opponent who lost to Vanderbilt in their opener, I should say, this year. Virginia Tech favored by 3.5. I'm not betting on this game, but if I was forced to pick something, I'd take Rutgers money line on the road. I do think Greg Schiano's got a good Rutgers team this year, and I think this will be a good opportunity on the road for them to really show what they're made of, even though it's against an ACC opponent that lost to a bottom-tier SEC opponent. I think this will be a good effort from Rutgers. That's what I'm predicting. All right, into the night slate. We've got Northwestern at Washington. Washington's first game against a Big Ten opponent, and Northwestern's first game against a former Pac-12 opponent. Washington favored by 12, coming off that loss to the Washington State Cougars in the Apple Cup. And I expect them to take care of business here. I think Northwestern might be a bit of a mess right now. Maybe not as big of a mess as UCLA, but I do think with it being Washington at home and Northwestern's first big road game of the year, I think it will just be too much for the Wildcats. But hey, what do I know? I could be very wrong about that. Not betting on this game as well, but the next game that I am betting on is coming up next year with Iowa at Minnesota in a trophy game, the Floyd of Rosedale. And I was worried I might call that trophy by the wrong name because our friend Dustin Schutte, he put this on social media the other day. The Pig of Rosedale or something that his brother called it. If you happen to not see that, you might not get the joke, but kind of thought it was funny when I saw that the other day. But so this is going to be a battle of defenses. Minnesota has 2 straight shutouts. Iowa, historically known for having one of the most stout defenses in college football. And I'm betting the under in this game, minus 35.5. I think I got it at 36.5. But I feel like this will be a game that easily hits the under. I don't think Minnesota or Iowa have shown that they can put up a lot of points, and especially when each of them are known for good defenses, I think they'll struggle to score. So I'm taking the under in this game as the second leg of the parlay. And a couple more games to get through real quick. Michigan State at Boston College. The Spartans taking on Bill O'Brien, who had that big win against Florida State. How big was it actually? Maybe not big at all, considering Florida State hasn't won a game yet. A lot of people thought it was good. And Bill O'Brien, been a good coach at the college level before. He was once previously the head coach at Penn State before trying his luck at the NFL. And this will be a good test for Michigan State on the road, even though it's probably not going to be the most hostile of environments. Boston College, surprisingly nearly favored by an entire touchdown. Maybe this is my Big Ten bias showing, but I'm not actually betting, but I always just tell you what I would do if I was betting the game. I'd take Michigan State money line here. I think Michigan State is well coached with just as much as Boston College is well coached with Bill O'Brien. I think Jonathan Smith already getting that road win at Maryland was big, and now you're going up to Boston College on the road, and not the easiest way to start off your head coaching tenure with road games this early, especially against power opponents. But I think Michigan State could pull off, I guess would be a technical upset here. So we'll see. And then Purdue, boy, Purdue, after their beat down but getting beat down by Notre Dame, 66-7, if I'm not mistaken, was the score. They're going all the way out west to face Oregon State on the CW network. What an odd TV channel to have college football on. Oregon State favored by 4.5. I don't really know what to expect from this game. Will Purdue bounce back? Will we see any of what Purdue did against Indiana State in this? Because Oregon State, a much inferior opponent than Notre Dame, but maybe Purdue really is just that bad. Again, that remains to be seen. I'm staying away from this. It wouldn't surprise me if Oregon State beats them by 30. It wouldn't surprise me if Purdue finds a way to make this a good game. So I guess we'll find out more about the Boilermakers after this weekend. And then one last thing I want to share before we move on. It is my final leg of the parlay, and it's from the top 25. It's from the game number 12 Utah at number 14 Oklahoma State. Whenever I bet this earlier in the week, Utah was favored. And now it appears that Oklahoma State is 2.5-point favorites. And I've got Oklahoma State money line. Again, I would have taken, if the line now being what it is, I would take Oklahoma State to cover. But the early spread, I believe, was -2.5, -2 for Utah, which, lines shift and stuff like that. So it makes sense. But if I were betting now, I think I would still take Oklahoma State to cover 2.5. It's close enough to really, it's just a one-score game if they can win by at least a field goal. So play whatever you want there. You won't have the exact same thing that I have necessarily, but I got in on it early enough to get the money line pick. So those are my picks for the week. Hopefully we go 3 for 3. And maybe even last week we threw in that extra UK one on the side. Throw in Indiana -28.5 if you're feeling it. Everybody I've talked to that I've spoken to about the Indiana game thinks that line for Indiana is just way too low. And they think Indiana will really take care of business against Charlotte. So maybe throw that one in there as well if you want to put some love on the Hoosiers. So we'll move on from there. That's going to wrap it up for us today. Thank you for checking in with us each and every day this week. We'll be back on Monday to do another week of In Touch with Indiana Sports. And also tune in tomorrow, live after the game ends, with Indiana football versus Charlotte, as Kyler and I break down the 4th Indiana football game as they get a third of the way through the season. And if you want to leave us a message, hit the hotline 502-830-9195. And also remember to subscribe to Hoosier Illustrated on YouTube. And if you want to be notified when we go live, hit the notification bell, and you'll know exactly when new posts are uploaded. And again, when we go live for the postgame show. So until then, this has been another episode of let's try that again. Until then, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.